So tell me if you relate to this. You are a full-blown adult. You've done a lot of growth work, a lot of healing work. You have changed a number of your patterns. But then when you go home for Thanksgiving and you reach out and turn that doorknob and open that door, all of a sudden you feel like you are back in the old role you grew up with. Your behavior might fall right back into that role. Everybody else's behavior is certainly still in that role, and you feel frustrated and distressed. So I want to talk about those family roles that develop in dysfunctional families and are very, very pervasive. And I think you'll have a bit more understanding of why this happens and of what you might need to do to continue your progress on this matter. So a lot of families have roles. In dysfunctional families, these roles become very, very rigid, and the roles become extremely restricting around who you are, what you do, what your behavior is about, maybe even whether you achieve things in life or not. Family roles began to be researched within the concept of family systems theory, which is actually a great concept to understand, and these roles have really been proven through research to apply to many families who had a significant dysfunction. And so just for a moment on family systems, because I know that might sound like therapy talk, but families are a system, and systems are very hard to change. So a school is a system, a government is a system, groups of people together develop systems. So when we think about the family as a system, rather than as sort of a bunch of individuals, right? There are a bunch of individuals, and there's a system that's developed. And it's the system that keeps people back in these roles. So there are basically 6 roles in a dysfunctional family. I'm going to talk a bit about the key characteristics of each role, and then also acknowledge the strengths that come with that role, as well as the drawbacks and difficulties. I'm also going to create individual videos on each one of these roles to delve into it a little bit deeper. So if you're not subscribed to the channel, please do hit that subscribe button. And if you end up liking this video, you can give it a like as well. It's very helpful. 2 of the roles of the 6 are the parents. Now, usually you will have one parent who has some type of dysfunction and another parent who might be the enabler. And I want to say sometimes the dysfunction is tied to alcoholism, mental illness, a real physical disability that ends up impacting the entire family dynamic. And then we'll also talk about how those 4 roles that are the children's roles, some of them might develop into the enabler, and others of them might develop into the person with the addiction or alcoholism personality disorder, right? And I want to be clear when I talk about this, because I'm not blaming the person who has the issue, because you will understand as you begin to really look into this, how this develops intergenerationally. One generation passes the patterns to the next, to the next, and to the next. And you might sit there and be like, yeah, well, why can't they change? And one of the problems is the systems issue, right? Also long-standing habits. Does the person want to change? Can they change? It can be hard to change even when you want to, right? You know that, given that doorknob example of going home for Thanksgiving. And you can think of a family as a mobile, like one of those Calder mobiles that everything is balanced and hanging, right? So if one person changes, it's all in balance. One person changes, even for the better, the whole mobile gets out of whack. And so the family in this position here, the ones who haven't changed, they're going to try to get that person to go back, even if it's back to bad behavior. But the positive of this example is that if you change, and you really can change, your family will have to adapt somehow. Does not mean they'll change the way you'd want them to, but they will need to change. They will need to adapt. But that's sort of the struggle in a family system between the individual who wants to change and the system which is trying to keep that person in place. So the 4 roles of the children are the hero child, the scapegoat, the mascot, and the lost child. So let's start with the hero child. Most dysfunctional families will have one child who is designated the hero. This is the child who achieves at everything. This is the child who looks great to the outside world. This can often be the oldest child, but not always. But the parents will give a lot of positive reinforcement to this hero child, and they will hold this hero child up as proof that they are not dysfunctional. So that hero child's role is to keep that family looking good. The hero child supports the fantasy that this family is highly functioning and the parents are okay. And this actually ends up being very difficult on that child as they grow up, usually. Not always, but often that child can grow up really feeling like they're not worth anything if they don't succeed, right? Like they become driven to succeed at all costs because they have to. There's no choice in there. It's a rigid rule. They're driven, and at core, they never quite feel good enough because they never quite felt like they really deserved all of those accolades, all of that praise from their parents. They never really deserved being treated so differently than their siblings. But that gets kind of pushed down. But that guilt remains kind of underneath their approach to the world really for the rest of their lives unless they decide to get help. The hero child also can cut off their vulnerability. They're not allowed to show that they are sick or tired or doing anything other than achieving and showing that smiling good face to the world, right? So they cut off a part of themselves. And that brings us to the scapegoat. The scapegoat gets all the blame for everything. So the scapegoat is the child in the family who can be the identified patient. If the family ends up in therapy, it's usually because the scapegoat is the problem. Any problem in the family can be blamed on the scapegoat. If the scapegoat fights with the hero child, the parents probably don't even see what the hero child did wrong. They blame everything on the scapegoat. And while the scapegoat is being blamed both internally inside the family and externally in society, the parents can point to that hero child and say, see, we're not the problem. This child's the problem because we have that one who's doing so well. Now, the scapegoat can grow up. There's pros and cons here, okay? They can definitely grow up with a feeling of I'm bad. I'm inherently bad. And that can lead to really self-destructive behaviors. Because if you feel that you are inherently bad, when you hit high school, why not engage in bad behaviors, right? Why not develop friends with the troubled kids or, because that's who you feel you are supposed to fit with. So when that role is very rigid and the scapegoat internalizes it, they can actually become an addict themselves. There's a real risk that the scapegoat might develop self-destructive behavior. On the flip side, the scapegoat sometimes ends up being the most resilient of all the children. The scapegoat later in life, middle age and on, might actually be the highest functioning of all the children because the scapegoat, to the extent that they are also a truth teller, they see what's happening in the family, they speak it, right? Which does not make them popular, but they see the truth. And if they can externalize the problem, therapy can really help, or self-help work or all sorts of work could really help that scapegoat realize, actually, I wasn't the problem. The problems existed before I was born. So to the extent that can be externalized, that scapegoat can have a better view of reality and a lot of resilience. Okay, let's bring up number 3, the mascot. The mascot is the one who makes a joke whenever there's tension. The mascot might be a performer, might love to start dancing, but usually it's a little bit more clownish. The mascot loves to make people laugh. The mascot can't stand conflict, so jumps in right away to distract what's happening. As the mascot grows up, they can be that friend who's great to have around, who always is making everybody laugh. They can be super popular, but internally, they are cutting off any difficult emotions. So they too can easily go that route of drugs and alcohol, which numb us out. They also contribute to the party feeling, right? And the mascot doesn't learn to deal with all sides of life, right? So it can also limit relationships. And I'm going to talk more about the mascot in a separate video. So make sure you do check that one out because this is an interesting role. And I've found that this role can actually sort of work for people for a long time until, boom, it no longer works. Okay, role number 4, the lost child. The lost child is the one who hides under the table, hides in the closet, Anytime there's conflict, the lost child withdraws. The lost child ends up being somewhat neglected because they basically just turn into themselves and avoid any of the difficulties. Lost children, when they grow up, they can sometimes live across the world from the rest of their family. They disappear. The lost child is often the youngest. Again, not always, but the lost child is very vulnerable, and the way that they deal with that vulnerability is to go inward. So they often become an introvert, which is not a bad thing at all, but they may not develop a sense of safety in the world or in relationships. They often don't have a voice. They avoid conflict so much, they don't speak up for themselves. That can be really limiting later in life. And all of these rigid roles develop to deflect the attention away from the real problem. Now, I mentioned a couple of roles that can turn into one of the positions, but honestly, any one of these 4 roles can recreate these patterns in their own families when they grow up, and they can become really either the sort of addict or dysfunctional person, or they can become the enabler. Really, any one of the roles, I think it's sort of felt a little more commonly that the hero child will move into an enabling relationship, but sometimes the hero child loses it and they go the opposite direction as well. The lost child could go either way, right? So any one of these roles can end up recreating this pattern in their new families or even in their friend groups, right? That if you're not married yet, you don't have a family yet, you might be able to pick up in your friend group who plays these different roles and why. So rigid roles are not good for anyone. We need to be able to feel all parts of ourselves, accept the parts of ourselves that are strong and capable and the parts of ourselves that are scared and weak. We need to be full people to really live authentically and with joy and with a feeling of self-compassion and self-confidence. We really need to accept all parts of ourselves which are not represented if we're following a rigid role. If this has resonated with you, I would love to help. I have a program called Roadmap to Joy and Authentic Confidence. It's a 6-month program, but you can do it at your own pace, and it really works on tapping into authentically who you are, transforming some of those negative core beliefs that might be underneath your role, and learning to live with joy and peace. So you'll be able to walk into that Thanksgiving home with a totally different attitude. I'll link it below, and I'll see you there.